You were talking a lot about the characteristics of democracy, or what we want it to be at least, but then can we shift to what are the more obvious ways to identify an authoritarian system?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something which I myself have gone through quite a lot of change on in the way I've thought about it. I mean, the traditional view, and probably the one which is the most common for people across the world, is the idea of a free and fair election. And I think that, for me at least, boils down to the question of, can you remove a government if enough people vote in a certain way in a free and fair process? So is it possible to remove a government through a legal free and fair process, which doesn't involve having to go outside the rules of the game, use violence, use other mechanisms? And I think that does represent a clear differentiation of some states, North Korea, Eritrea, that's the government in Saudi Arabia, the government's never going to be removed through a free and fair election. So that's one aspect. But then I think we also have to keep in mind that elections are also pretty flawed as well, based on various different types of both constitutional and sort of extra constitutional. So, the role of money, the role of educational privilege, the role of networks, all this sort of thing. These all play a role in making electoral processes unfair, even if technically they're free and open. Yeah, so I think there is a question there about the role of elections, but I think it's also about, one thing that I've found particularly influential is the work of Marlies Glacius, who's written about authoritarianism as being about sabotaging accountability. So her work looks at Hungary, but it also looks at India, at the US, and so forth, and tries to think about practices of authoritarianism rather than the idea that you have authoritarian states and democratic states, but actually you can have authoritarian things happening within notionally democratic states. If you're, from a particular background, or, a good example would be, for example, some of the things that the Trump administration in the US has been saying about or rather Trump himself, I'm not sure if any of his officials have said this yet, about the idea of delaying the election. I think he tweeted about this a couple of weeks ago, basically saying, the postal voting isn't reliable, so we need to delay the election so we can get all this in order. And that's an example, I think, of sabotaging accountability by basically trying to discredit the electoral process so that enough people think this is not a legitimate process, so that if he were to lose, he can go back and say, well, this was not fair, it should have been delayed, calling it into question. And there's all sorts of things, press conferences where he will not answer questions or refuse to answer questions, and much more profound elements of sabotaging accountability can be seen as well. I think if you look at the way the lockdown was enforced in India, the police using sticks to beat people to get into their homes. In South Africa, we saw the police shooting people in some cases, and there's a sense that there's no real accountability for that. What can you do about that? You can potentially complain, go to the local police authorities or whatever. But I think if there's a sense that you're not able to get justice for something which is clearly wrong, then that's an element of authoritarianism, even if it's within a country which has free and fair elections.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So in terms of how they consolidate power, how does it relate back to all of this? Like, is there a difference with how authoritarian systems try to consolidate power, or to remain in power for a longer period of time? Is that something that's characteristic of authoritarian systems? Like, do they do things different to how democracies would do it?
Yeah, I suppose I'd probably see it as more of a spectrum than a clear binary difference. I mean, both authoritarian and democratic spaces use both coercion and co-option to remain in power. I mean, you tend to see coercion used a lot more in more authoritarian spaces. So, secret police, arrest and harassment of opposition. These are things which are less characteristic of, and indeed would increasingly delegitimize governments in democratic states. Although we do see, you know, as the stuff we've seen in the US over the last couple of months has shown, you do see abuses being committed by police in democracies in a way which doesn't seem to fundamentally destabilize the political settlement. So I think we do see a spectrum in terms of coercion, but also co-option. And people often say that authoritarian states, one of the ways that they stay in power is effectively by giving people incentives to either support them or at least not to oppose them. So, you know, the handing out of particular resources to elites or to different ethnic groups who may or may not be the majority or a powerful minority. But I also don't think we should see democracy as completely immune from the nature of co-option. I mean, what is the difference between promising certain things in an election to a certain constituency versus what I've just said in relation to more authoritarian settings? It's more institutionalized. It's maybe less based around a particular ethnic group as opposed to a region. But there is a blurred line, I think, to some extent. But I think one of the things which does, I think, differentiate the two systems to some degree is the role of ideas and what is promoted by the government or the system as being the centerpiece of political power, what makes them legitimate. And I think that in most democracies, the fact that the government was elected is a centerpiece of what they would claim as being their legitimacy. I think one of the reasons why we've seen a lot more kind of support for the lockdown in the UK, at least before May or whenever it was when the Prime Minister's advisor went to that castle and all that other nonsense, was because people sort of, even if they disagree with the government, they see it as legitimately elected. Therefore, you know, it has a responsibility and a right to implement certain things. Whereas in more authoritarian systems, the ideas of legitimacy might come from elsewhere. The idea of a kind of father figure in many cases, or, you know, a unifying figure, or nationalism, populism. So I think that the centerpiece of ideas is really where the difference can often be seen.
Okay. So that's one of the core differences with democracy and authoritarian. Like, how democracies sustain their power would then be that they hold on to the fact that they are elected.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's blurred because you often get authoritarian states that claim to be democratic. I mean, even Nazi Germany had a sort of version of democratic discourse, which was about kind of that we somehow represent the people through this sort of you know, complex process of representing their aspirations and their interests. So there was a sort of democratic discourse within that as well. But I think that the idea that you have the ability and the right and the responsibility to challenge the government through, not just through elections, but also through other processes, you know, lobbying or mobilization, opposition, I think is a central idea which does differentiate more democratic systems from more authoritarian systems, where if we look at places like Zambia or Tanzania, places which have a history of democratic politics, but have become increasingly authoritarian over the last few years, the first thing to start being undermined is the idea that you can challenge the government, or it's legitimate to challenge the government, and that's been accompanied by restrictions on opposition activity, you know, reporting in the media, things like that. So I think that idea of challenge and that the government doesn't enjoy a monopoly of legitimacy is part of the difference.
Okay. So we're seeing, I mean, established democracies suddenly take a turn and almost being questioned if there's a rise in authoritarianism in those countries, like in India. But my question is, who decides if a system takes a democratic turn? Like, would it be the politicians or the people who suddenly decide to engineer this change, like especially in countries that take a rapid turn? Is it rapid to begin with, or do you think like it's something that's built up over time? That's two questions in one, sorry.
I think I can probably speak to them both in the same way, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think probably a lot of scholars would say that what we're seeing in places like India or Hungary or the UK or the US is not a new thing necessarily, that it has its origins in sort of debates and divisions that have been happening for a number of decades. I mean, a lot of the groundwork around some of the Trump stuff can be found in the 2000s and even the 1990s, with the sort of big divisions within the US political and social spheres around the role of religion, or notional kind of family values, cultural values around things about gay marriage or abortion, or these sorts of things. Which were less of a kind of party political issue in the the 70s or the 80s, for example. So I think you can trace a kind of provenance for this, and so I think we can't necessarily say this is something which is happening right now and is unprecedented or doesn't have a history. I think we do need to see these things in their context. What was the first question?
Who decides? Who decides if a country takes it?
Yeah, well, that's I guess it's very difficult to pin that one down because a lot of these people come to power, and all these kind of administrations come to office through popular election, and as I said at the beginning, they marshal this language of democracy and language of pushing away all of the corruption and the sort of edifices of the past. And going direct to the people over the head of the politicians. So to some extent, they're trying to balance the notion that there's something wrong with the political class with the idea that I or my kind of cohort can represent people in a more direct and more accessible way. So I think the people are ultimately part of that, because they're the ones they're electing it, and they're the people that are being spoken to and marshaled for these sorts of campaigns. I suppose the challenge is, I guess the question sort of getting to at what point does that switch? At what point do the people cease to be part of that equation? And I think actually it's a very difficult thing to reflect on, because if we think about the room, I watched a really interesting program the other day actually about Imelda Marcos, the widow of Ferdinand Marcos, who was a Filipino sort of initially democratically elected leader, but he then became a dictator. And this program was all about sort of what happened to Imelda Marcos after her husband was overthrown. And, she's now or she was at least a congresswoman in the Filipino House of Representatives. Both of her children are senators. Her son very narrowly lost out on being elected vice president. So I think we have to keep in mind that even when democracies sort of turn into more authoritarian systems, there will still be a lot of people, probably not the majority, but a significant part of the population which sees some level of legitimacy in that system. And indeed, they may actually see it as democratic. They may see that this authoritarian behavior is necessary in order to safeguard democracy against, some notional threat of insecurity or whatever from somewhere else. So, I think it's important to not necessarily see a kind of the people, once something turns authoritarian, are no longer part of the process. No, very few political regimes can survive without the support of the people, or at least a segment of the people in some certain way. And that's the same for authoritarian regimes. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Okay. Yeah, that's super interesting, because you just can't, it's tough to ever put a pin on that. Yeah, it was a bit of a blurry question.